Greetings from the Philippines. It is my pleasure to join you in this symposium in Geneva, entitled Protecting People on the Move, Internally Displaced Peoples in the Context of the Refugee and Migrant Crisis, with particular focus on Iraq, Syria, and Azerbaijan. I would like to thank the Geneva Center for Human Rights Advancement and Global Dialogue, as well as the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, in cooperation with the Permanent Mission of the United Arab Emirates, for having invited me to grace you even remotely. We all know the internally displaced person situations worldwide through the work that is being done by many organizations in the United Nations, as well as non-government organizations like the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. And in all these situations, over the years, we know that the protection of IDPs is an essential matter of implementing international obligations to protect the human rights of internally displaced persons. In the end of the day, it is the state that is primarily responsible for the respect and guarantee of those rights, and to prevent those human rights violations that cause displacement, including arbitrary displacement, as well as those human rights violations that protract the situation of internal displacement. It is therefore very important for me to cite in this symposium the existence of the UN Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, of which you know, and of which we are now presently commemorating its 20th anniversary. As an international human rights and international humanitarian lawyer, the guiding principles for me has always been a very convenient compilation of these international obligations. When I started out in the work to protect internally displaced persons, there were no guiding principles on internal displacement, and in fact we called what we know now as IDPs, we called them internal refugees. And this is why I do still commend the United Nations for having endorsed these important principles, and we need to commemorate and implement the guiding principles to this day. In the context of the migration and refugee crisis, the link with internal displacement for me is very clear. I have just returned from a official country mission from Libya, upon the kind invitation of the Government of National Accord of Libya. And there, during that short country mission, I met with many internally displaced persons. And in those interviews, when I consulted them and heard their stories, in their desperation and frustration, many of them actually made it very clear to me that they are considering crossing the sea, that is the Mediterranean. And in fact, recent arrivals in Italy, just about 2 weeks ago, have shown that there was an increase of Libyans in the mixed migratory situation of those arrivals among the migrants and refugees. In my press conference concerning my country mission to Libya, I had in fact urged the Libyan government to comprehensively protect the human rights of IDPs in efforts to prevent internal displacement and to protect the internally displaced persons themselves, as well as to resolve protracted international displacement situations. And in this case, to not contribute to the continuing migratory and refugee flows to Europe. This link between internal displacement and migration and the refugee situation actually is very clear to me. And within that context, I have therefore issued just recently this week an open letter to the states and to the different stakeholders who are involved in the negotiations in the global compacts on migration and on refugees. And in this open letter, I have urged the states and stakeholders to take note that the prevention of internal displacement, in accordance with the guiding principles on internal displacement, is very essential in order to resolve the matter of migration and refugees. Protection remains essential and inherent in all our endeavors on migration and refugees. In addition to Libya, I also would like to cite the internal displacement situation in Iraq, in which you are very interested in this symposium. My predecessor, Chaloka Biani, had actually visited Iraq on a country mission before I had assumed the office in late 2016. The situation of hundreds and thousands of internally displaced persons in Iraq, which actually has caused a lot of their migration and refugee situation as well, remains a cause of considerable concern. The recent defeat of the Islamic State in Mosul came at a heavy price, with nearly 1 million people having to flee the city that has largely been devastated, surpassing the worst-case scenarios predicted by humanitarian responders. While the worst-case scenarios predicted by these humanitarian responders actually still remain, the worst fighting may have ceased, the human cost of the conflict and the migration and refugee flows that have emanated from it continues to be counted. Humanitarian partners are struggling to meet the needs of displaced persons. While some returns are definitely possible, many other IDPs from the conflict are facing protracted displacement conditions and remain in camps and host communities, sometimes years after their very initial displacement. And of course, we know that many Iraqi migrants and special refugees remain in places of refuge elsewhere. They remain heavily reliant on humanitarian assistance, with few short-term prospects of return to their homes and other durable solutions. Minority communities were particularly targeted and affected by the displacement, including the groups such as the Yazidis. And finding solutions for them as minorities must also be a high priority of the government, where possible, to ensure their return to their historic territories and homes in safety and dignity, and to rebuild devastated communities as well as their trust. Rapidly moving from humanitarian assistance to recovery and development approaches will be very critical to finding durable solutions. The government must fulfill its commitment to IDPs while addressing their recovery will require the continuing support of the international donor community and the international humanitarian, human rights, and development community. In both of these country situations, which have been governed by my mandate, it is very clear to me that there are various factors that would really link internal displacement with migration and refugee flows. The primary responsible entity for the protection of internally displaced persons remain the governments that, in this particular case, Libya and as well as Iraq. In my engagement with the government of Libya, for example, I have urged them to really give serious attention to this, and my report to the Human Rights Council will be presented in June 2018, very, very soon. In all my dealings concerning the implementation of the guiding principles of internal displacement, one thing is very clear to me as well, and that is it is only with the concerted and comprehensive efforts of both the governments and with the international communities, both governments as well as civil society, and naturally the UN agencies, that can together resolve the situation. In Iraq, for example, the L3 situation, the L3 level has just been lifted by the Interagency Standing Committee, of which I am also a part of. Nevertheless, despite the lifting of the L3 level of situation in Iraq, it is still primordial for the international community to lend their hands and efforts concerning rebuilding Iraq on the basis of their human rights. In conclusion, in sharing these two country examples, I wanted to share with you today, it's still my hope that as advocates for the human rights of internally displaced persons, we all move forward in the spirit and letter of the principles that are in the guiding principles of internal displacement, especially in this momentous year and beyond. In all our joint endeavors, let us remember, though, that internally displaced persons are the rights holders and that they should always participate in all decision-making processes and the decisions themselves that concern them. With this, I would like to leave you with these few thoughts and experiences, and I wish you good luck in the continuation of this symposium. Thank you very much.